The first time I saw her, she walked into the conference room like a headline. Not a woman, but a story already written, waiting for someone else to read it aloud. We had been sitting there for 10 minutes, in that long glass chamber that smelled like new carpet and cold ambition. No one spoke. The screen on the wall still glowed with Greg's name, our CEO, who had been gone for weeks on a wellness retreat in Santorini. Everyone was wondering the same thing. Why the emergency meeting? Why the sudden return? Why the rumors about a new direction? When the door opened, it was Greg who entered first. It was her. She moved through the doorway like she belonged to the light itself, white suit, silver phone, that precise kind of walk that women practice in mirrors before they become powerful. Alara Quinn. At that moment, I didn't know her name yet, but the silence told me everyone else did. Behind her came Greg, tanned and rested, smiling with the satisfaction of a man who had spent a month meditating while other people held the world together for him. His hand rested lightly on the small of her back. It was a possessive touch disguised as affection. "Good morning, everyone," he said. "I hope you're ready for some changes. The kind of changes that make people hold their breath." Alara smiled, the corners of her lips perfectly calibrated. "Helixon Therapeutics," she began, "is entering a new era. We need to think bigger, faster, freer, less red tape, less fear, more creativity." Her voice was smooth, confident, trained for microphones. Around the table, heads began to nod, hesitant at first, then faster, the way people do when they realize their jobs might depend on enthusiasm. She tapped her sleek rose gold laptop, projecting a slide titled Reimagining Compliance. I felt my stomach tight. It was a word I had spent my life defending, and here it was being rebranded into something fragile and pretty. Greg smiled beside her. "Alara will be joining our executive team as Strategic Innovation Advisor," he said, as if the words themselves carried authority. "She'll be working closely with all of you to bring new perspectives." Her gaze swept the room like a searchlight until it landed on me. "Especially with compliance," she said, and the temperature seemed to drop a degree. "I've heard that department is meticulous, maybe too meticulous." A few people laughed softly. I didn't. I looked up from my folder, met her eyes, and said, "Meticulous is the reason we still exist." The laughter died. Alara's smile didn't fade, but something behind it did, a flicker of irritation, quickly hidden. "I admire that," she said sweetly. "Process is important, but creativity keeps the process alive, don't you think?" "I think laws do," I answered. She tilted her head, and Greg stepped in with his easy executive chuckle. "That's why we need balance," he said. "Compliance and innovation. Safety and speed, old and new." Old and new, I had heard that before. It always meant someone was about to be replaced. The meeting continued with words like synergy, vision, and paradigm. I wrote nothing down. I had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous phrases in corporate language always sounded harmless. Fresh perspective. Simplify workflow. Empower creativity. They all meant the same thing: someone wants your job. By the time Greg ended the session, Alara had charmed the room. Even Marcus from legal, who usually sat like a statue, had leaned forward, smiling in ways that made me uncomfortable. When people began to file out, Alara crossed the room toward me. Her perfume arrived first, something light, expensive, not meant to be remembered, only recognized. She held out her hand. "Salem Chandler," she said, reading the nameplate on my folder. "Greg told me about you. 13 years here, right? 14? 14, I said. "Wow, you must really love this place." I looked at her hand, then took it. Her grip was soft but deliberate, the way you touch something you plan to move later. "It's kept me busy," I said. She smiled wider. "I'm sure we'll be great partners." "I'm sure we'll find out," I replied. Her eyes flickered with something I recognized instantly: competition disguised as friendship. Then she was gone, her heels clicking down the hall like punctuation marks. That afternoon, the entire floor changed. Boxes appeared. New desks were assembled by men in polo shirts who moved with quiet urgency. By 5 o'clock, a group of young people in identical beige sneakers were taking selfies in front of the Helixon logo. They were Alara's team. "Innovation consultants," someone whispered. "Digital transformation experts." I had seen the type before. They knew everything about branding and nothing about liability. One of them wandered into my office carrying a ring light. "Hey," he said, chewing gum, "is this the compliance area?" "Yes," I said. He looked around like it was a museum. "Cool. Alara says we're gonna help make all this more like agile." "Agile," I repeated. "That's a nice word. What does it mean?" He shrugged. "Less rules, more results, I guess." "Then you're in the wrong department." He laughed, thinking I was joking. I didn't correct him. By 7, the building was empty again. I stayed. I always stayed. My office lights reflected off the glass walls, and for a moment I could see myself multiplied, one Salem for each version of Helixson I had survived. The loyal one, the tired one, the cautious one, the one who had learned that loyalty was the currency most companies spent freely. On my desk, a small black folder waited. Inside were my certifications, pages and seals that represented years of audits, renewals, and background checks. In this industry, they were more than credentials. They were lifelines. Without them, Helixson couldn't legally operate. I ran my finger over the embossed letters on the first page: Regulatory Compliance Certification, European Medicines Authority. Below it, my name, Salem L. Chandler. Valid through 2026. People thought compliance was about paperwork. It was. It was about trust. Every signature on every document meant lives wouldn't be lost because someone skipped a step. It was invisible work, thankless, dull, but absolute. And now, apparently, it was optional. I closed the folder and opened my laptop. The company dashboard glowed, stable, predictable, obedient. Every certification, every record, every audit logged and archived. 14 years of order. At the bottom corner of my screen was a small tab labeled Archive Protocol 9B. I clicked it just to see if it still worked. A password prompt appeared. I typed a long string of numbers I hadn't used in years. The screen blinked green. Access granted. A list of backup files appeared, encrypted, time-stamped, silent. My own private vault, created during the merger in case the IT department ever accidentally optimized our compliance records. I stared at the line of text: Certification Dependency Override, active. It meant that if my employment ever ended without documented cause, every license tied to my credentials would automatically expire within 48 hours. A safety net, or a fuse, depending on how you looked at it. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled. Maybe I had built it out of paranoia, maybe out of instinct. Either way, it was still there. Outside the window, London glittered like data on a server, cold, perfect, untouchable. Inside, I saved my work, shut down the laptop, and whispered to the empty room, "Let's see how creative she really is." That night the city didn't sleep, and neither did I. From my window the skyline glowed like an open circuit, pulsing, humming, alive with too many lights for one heart to handle. Helixson's tower stood among them, tall and glassy, pretending to be transparent. But I knew what hid behind its windows. I had spent 14 years making sure the shine stayed legal. Every license, every audit, every regulation woven together like threads keeping the entire empire from unraveling. Now someone wanted to cut those threads for the sake of aesthetics. On my kitchen counter, my phone blinked again. A new message from Human Resources: Leadership Restructuring Meeting. Tomorrow. 9:00 a.m. Attendance mandatory. The kind of email that didn't need punctuation to sound like a threat. I poured myself a glass of red wine and sat down at the dining table, the same one I used to spread compliance binders across back when I thought dedication was a shield. The laptop screen reflected my face, pale in the dim light, surrounded by numbers and files that had once meant security. I opened my old archive again. The folder labeled Section 9B glowed faintly in the directory. I hadn't created it for revenge. I had built it the way a careful engineer installs a failsafe, just in case someone smarter on paper turned out to be reckless in practice. Now, that small clause buried in my employment contract might be the only line between me and extinction. I clicked open a file called Ownership Clause Revision, Draft 2018. My own notes appeared, typed in neat black text. Involuntary termination, without cause voids, employee held federal and EMA certifications within 48 hours. I remembered the day I negotiated that clause. My lawyer had called it excessive. I had called it insurance. The wine tasted sharp, dry, grounding. I closed the document and looked around my apartment. No photographs, just plants, shelves of old policy manuals, and a desk covered in neat stacks of paper. It wasn't much of a life, but it was orderly. Predictable. The opposite of Alara Quinn. Somewhere across the river, she was probably celebrating, drinking champagne, posting filtered stories about first day of change. She had no idea that change had already been written into the system long before she arrived. I saved my files again. A faint sound echoed through the apartment, the quiet chime of my home security system cycling on. Habit, routine, control. The three things that had kept me employed this long. I sat back and whispered into the still air, "They think they're rewriting the rules." Then I smiled. Let's see what happens when the rules write back. Morning arrived gray and soft, the kind of weather that makes the city look washed in logic. My alarm buzzed at 6. I showered, ironed my blouse, tied my hair into a neat twist. The same ritual I had followed every day for 14 years. Some people wore confidence, I wore precision. By 8:30, I was in the elevator, holding a folder under my arm. The ride up to the 20th floor felt longer than usual. The mirrored walls reflected my calm expression back at me, but my pulse kept time with the ascending numbers. The doors opened to chaos. The innovation team was already buzzing like bees without a queen. Screens glowed. Laptops blinked. Someone was filming a clip for the company's social media page. Alara stood near Greg's office, radiant in a pale blue suit. She was laughing at something he said, the kind of laugh that sounds rehearsed. When she noticed me, her smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened, calculating. "Salem," she said brightly. "Big day, so I hear. You'll love what we're doing," she said. "Less duplication, more freedom. We're simplifying the compliance chain so innovation can breathe." I raised an eyebrow. I didn't realize innovation was suffocating. She laughed again. "You know what I mean. Don't worry, we'll keep you involved, in a slightly different capacity." "Involved," I repeated. "That's one word for it." She tilted her head, studying me as if she expected resistance. When I offered none, her confidence grew. "The meeting starts in 10, she said, turning away. I watched her disappear into the boardroom, surrounded by her people. Greg passed by a moment later, adjusting his tie. "Morning, Salem. Excited for the new chapter?" "I've read enough chapters to know how endings work," I said. He chuckled without hearing the warning. "You'll do fine. You always do." When he was gone, I entered my office one last time. The walls looked the same, but something invisible had shifted. My nameplate still gleamed beside the door. Salem Chandler, Director of Compliance. I traced the letters with my fingers, then lifted it off and set it gently into my briefcase. The air felt lighter after that. At exactly 9, I walked into the conference room. Everyone was already there, Greg at the head of the table, Alara beside him, and a row of executives trying to look neutral. Greg began with a speech about evolution, fresh perspectives, and realigning leadership. I had heard it all before, then he said my name. "Salem has been an incredible asset to Helixon," he began. "Her work has kept us compliant and competitive for over a decade. We're grateful for her dedication. But as we move forward, we need to adapt." He nodded toward Alara, who stood with a bright, practiced smile. "To support our new goals, we're introducing a merged role, Director of Compliance and Innovation, led by Alara Quinn." There was a polite round of applause. My heart didn't race. It never did in moments like this. Instead, I felt something slower, steadier, colder. Alara turned toward me, all kindness and grace. "You'll still be with us, of course, transitioning into a more focused role. We're calling it Process Coordination Advisor." Process Coordination Advisor. A fancy way of saying expendable. I smiled faintly. "That sounds very collaborative." She nodded, relief flooding her face. "Exactly. Collaboration is the future." The meeting continued, but I stopped listening. I already knew what came next: documents, handovers, goodbyes disguised as congratulations. When it ended, I shook Greg's hand, smiled for the cameras, and walked out. Back in my office, I locked the door, opened my laptop, and entered one command. The screen flickered. The old backup protocol opened, lines of code scrolling like a heartbeat. I typed in the final confirmation: "Activate 9B on termination." The system asked for verification. I entered my signature. A soft beep, then silence. 48 hours. That was the window between their arrogance and their consequences. I closed the laptop, unplugged it, and packed it carefully into my bag. When I lifted the folder of certificates from the wall, the sound of the nails pulling free felt like applause from an invisible audience. I looked around the room one last time. Every object had a memory, every file a scar. I whispered, "Good luck, innovators." Then I walked away. The next morning felt like the first breath after an explosion, quiet, powdery, full of floating dust that hadn't realized it should fall yet. When I arrived at Helixon, my access badge still worked. That surprised me. Most people didn't realize how long it took for HR to process terminations. Bureaucracy, the last loyal soldier. The 22nd floor looked different. The glass partitions that once separated departments had been removed overnight, replaced by open spaces filled with bean bags and half-assembled whiteboards. The scent of fresh paint and coffee pods hung in the air. Someone had drawn "Welcome to the Future" across the wall in thick green marker. At the far end, Alara stood beside a photographer, her hand resting casually on Greg's shoulder as they smiled for a company-wide announcement photo. Around them, her new recruits buzzed with nervous excitement, repeating her words like scripture. I slipped past the crowd and entered my office, no, my former office. The nameplate had already been replaced. It now read Innovation Hub Lead. Inside, a stranger sat at my desk, typing on my computer. He looked up, startled. "Oh, hey, sorry. You must be Salem." "I must be," I said. He grinned, the kind of grin that belongs to someone who has never read a confidentiality clause. "Alara told me you stopped by. I'm Toby, with an I at the end." "Toby," I stared. "Of course. I'm shadowing your old position while we, modernize it." He gestured at my monitor. "Pretty wild system you built. Half this stuff looks like code from the Stone Age." "That code," I said evenly, "is the reason the company hasn't been sued into extinction." He laughed. "Totally, but Alara thinks most of it can be automated. Compliance bots, AI verification, all that. Once we streamline things, you'll be amazed how simple it gets." "Simple isn't always safe." "Yeah," he said, swiveling in my chair, "but it's faster." I watched him for a long moment. His hair was too clean, his eyes too confident, and his hands moved through the system like someone handling fireworks with a candle. "Be careful," I said. "The architecture has interlocks. Delete the wrong chain and you could crash the entire audit trail." He waved his hand dismissively. "No worries, I backed up everything on Google Drive." I felt my stomach turn. Google Drive, as if 14 years of federal data could live safely beside his holiday photos. When I stepped out, Alara was in the hallway surrounded by her team. She was holding a bright yellow smoothie and talking fast, her sentences bubbling with energy. "We're reimagining verification," she said, moving from rigid compliance to adaptive trust. "Imagine approvals in seconds instead of days." One of the analysts nodded eagerly. "So we can skip some of the redundant checks?" "Exactly," Alara said. "We trust our people. We don't need walls made of paperwork." She noticed me then and smiled as if nothing about my existence required explanation. "Salem, we were just discussing efficiency. I'd love your thoughts." "On efficiency or survival?" She tilted her head. "You sound skeptical." "I'm consistent." Her tone softened, the way people do when they think kindness can cover ignorance. "You've built something incredible here, but systems should evolve. I know it's hard to let go." "I don't hold on to systems," I said. "I hold on to accountability." A few of her team shifted uncomfortably. She laughed it off and took a sip of her drink. "Well, accountability is everyone's job now." I looked around at the 20-somethings in matching sneakers. Then we're all in trouble. For the rest of the day, I wandered through the floor like a ghost. My new desk was in a shared workspace near accounts payable, far from the secure servers, far from relevance. From there, I could still see my old office through the glass wall, Toby leaning back in my chair while the compliance dashboard flickered behind him. At lunch, Marcus from legal found me by the coffee machine. "Heard they renamed your department," he said quietly. "Apparently I'm coordinating processes now," I said. His mouth twitched. "That sounds important." "It sounds like exile." He lowered his voice. "Watch yourself, Salem. The board loves Alara right now. Greg's selling her like a miracle." "Miracles are just math we don't understand yet," I said. "Eventually, someone checks the numbers." Marcus nodded, hesitated, then left. He was one of the few who knew the weight of the systems I had built, the invisible map of every certificate and approval binding Helixon to legality. By 5 o'clock, the building had grown quiet again. I opened my personal laptop, connected to the guest Wi-Fi, and logged into my hidden admin account. The internal dashboard still recognized my credentials. The access lights blinked green. I ran a silent trace through the compliance chains. Toby had already modified 3 verification templates, deleting redundancies he didn't understand. The audit log showed his user ID everywhere, a digital fingerprint smeared across the backbone of our licenses. He was dismantling the house while bragging about the view. I saved screenshots, timestamped them, and archived them in my personal drive. Documentation first, emotion later. When I shut the laptop, the city outside was sinking into evening. The windows glowed gold for a few seconds before turning black like eyes closing after a long day of pretending. Somewhere across the hall, I heard laughter, Alara's voice, bright and sharp, echoing through the glass. Greg's lower tone followed, warm and approving. I gathered my things and whispered to the empty room, "Keep laughing. You still have 47 hours." The next week felt like watching a slow leak in a submarine. You could hear the hiss, see the bubbles rising, but everyone else called it progress. Alara's new regime spread through Helixon like perfume, sweet at first, then suffocating. Every morning, she held innovation briefings, 10-minute pep talks filled with words like trust, empowerment, and velocity. Every afternoon, she deleted another rule. The first casualty was the morning verification checklist, 47 points I had designed after a near miss with an FDA audit 5 years ago. It had caught hundreds of small errors, the kind that could cost millions. Alara called it administrative noise. During a meeting, she announced it was obsolete. "We're embracing agility," she said. "Less rigidity, more human judgment." I raised my hand. Those checkpoints exist because human judgment fails. Greg gave me a tight smile, the kind reserved for children who don't understand adult conversations. "We're confident the team can handle it," he said. The team nodded, grateful for the chance to agree with power. Afterward, Marcus texted me one sentence: "She just deleted our parachute." He wasn't wrong. By the end of the week, Alara's digital strategists had full access to compliance servers. They walked through the floor carrying lattes and laptops, speaking a new language of disruption that didn't include the word law. One of them stopped by my new desk. "Salem, Alara wants you to send over your certification key file," she said. I looked up. "She wants my key?" "Yeah, something about centralizing access. She said it's slowing things down." I smiled thinly. "Tell her I'll need a formal written request signed by the CEO and verified by legal." The girl blinked, clearly unprepared for resistance. "Oh, okay, I'll let her know." "Please do," I said, and returned to my work, though there wasn't much work left to do. That afternoon, I checked the system logs again. Dozens of unauthorized edits. Automated approval macros where manual reviews had once existed. Tobai's name all over them. He was proud of his efficiency. He even bragged about it in a group chat that accidentally included me. "Clarissa, sorry, Alara says we're making history," he wrote. "She says Salem's methods are ancient." I took a screenshot. Documentation never sleeps. The following Monday, Greg sent out a company-wide email celebrating our first fully digital compliance submission. The message was full of exclamation marks and emojis, as if enthusiasm could replace regulation. I opened the submission myself. It had gone through in record time, 3 hours instead of the usual 2 days. The problem was, it contained a missing safety certificate and 2 unsigned attachments. I felt something inside me shift, not anger, not fear, something colder. A realization that the machine no longer needed my hands to destroy itself. I drafted an internal note, saved it under my personal folder. "Unauthorized submission approved without certification chain, flagged for record." Then I closed the file and made no attempt to fix it. 3 days later, Alara called me into the conference room. "Salem," she began brightly, "we're adjusting some workflows. You'll be moving into a new workspace on the 3rd floor, more collaborative, closer to finance." "The 3rd floor," I said slowly. That was where they sent accounts payable, procurement, and the people they hoped would resign quietly. She nodded, smiling. "You'll love it there, it has windows." "I already have windows." "Well," she said, standing, "now you'll have different ones." I didn't argue. I just watched her leave, her heels clicking across the marble like a countdown. Back at my office, I began to pack. My certificates came off the wall one by one, heavy glass frames, edges sharp enough to remind you of what they cost. Tobai appeared at the door, chewing gum. "Hey, Alara says I should get your access codes before you move, something about consolidating systems." I slid the certificates into a box. "Do you even know what these codes unlock?" He shrugged. "The compliance dashboard, right?" "Among other things." "Cool, you can just write them down for me, I'll take care of it." I turned, met his eyes. "No, Tobai, you won't," he laughed awkwardly. "Alara said you might be touchy about it." "I'm not touchy, I'm precise." He stood there for a second, uncertain, then left. When the room was quiet again, I knelt beside the filing cabinet and unlocked the bottom drawer. My personal laptop was there, wrapped in a gray sleeve. I placed it on the desk and powered it up. The familiar hum steadied me. I logged into the secure backup directory and began transferring files. 15 years of certifications, approvals, internal memos, and federal correspondence. Onto the encrypted drive labeled Vault 9B. As the progress bar crept forward, I looked out at the office one last time. Alara was laughing near the elevators, Greg beside her, both of them shining with self-satisfaction. Around them, the young strategists moved like dancers, unaware of the stage crumbling beneath their feet. The transfer reached 100%. I ejected the drive, slipped it into my coat pocket, and whispered to the room, "Lesson 1, gravity doesn't care about confidence." Then I turned off the lights. That night, I placed the drive inside a small lockbox under my bed. I didn't check my email, didn't look at my phone. The world could spin without me for once. When I finally slept, I dreamed of glass cracking, slowly, perfectly, without sound. The third floor smelled like printer ink and resignation. Most people there kept their heads down, their screens filled with spreadsheets that never reached the boardroom. It was a place for survivors, not soldiers. I had been moved into a corner desk by the window, close enough to see the river but too far to matter. My new title was printed on a thin sheet of paper taped to the wall, Process Coordination Advisor. It looked temporary, as if even the tape didn't believe it would stay. Alara sent a short email that morning. "Welcome to your new chapter, Salem. Let's collaborate soon." I read it twice, then archived it. Her words had the shine of diplomacy and the weight of dust. From my window, I could see the top floors where I used to work. I imagined the hum of the servers, the cold blue light of the compliance dashboard, the steady rhythm of control. Tobai now sat where I once did, tapping at keys he didn't understand, convinced that automation would save him from consequence. Around noon, he messaged me on the company chat. "Hey Salem, quick question. Can I delete the legacy verification tables? They're taking up space." I stared at the blinking cursor. I typed, "You can if you understand what they do." He sent back a thumbs-up emoji. That was answer enough. By mid-afternoon, I heard the first rumor. A missing certification, a file that wouldn't open, a digital signature that vanished from the server. People assumed it was a glitch. I knew better. Systems don't fail without help. They respond. At 5, I left my desk and walked up to the old floor under the excuse of retrieving a file. The security guard hesitated but waved me through when he saw my badge still active, another oversight in their streamlined process. The hallway outside the compliance office buzzed with new voices. The walls were plastered with motivational quotes. One said, "Move fast, trust faster." I almost laughed. Speed was their religion now, faith their only armor. Through the glass, I saw Tobai and Alara standing side by side, looking at the main dashboard. Lines of red text blinked across the screen, error notifications they didn't recognize. Alara frowned, then turned to Tobai. "Just restart it," she said. He nodded eagerly, pressing keys as if enthusiasm could fix ignorance. I stepped back before they saw me and took the stairs down. The building's hum felt different now, less like order and more like breath held too long. That night at home, I opened my personal laptop. The countdown had begun automatically when my status changed in the system. 48 hours until all certifications linked to my name expired. 48 hours until Helixon's operating authority dissolved. The number glowed on my screen, 46, 57, 33. I watched the seconds tick down. I had created the mechanism years ago after the merger when I realized how easily a corporation could rewrite people out of existence. It was meant to protect me. It was never meant to be used. Now it lived its own quiet life, buried in the code like a seed waiting for the right season. The next day, I received a call from Marcus. His voice was low. "Something's wrong with the submission portal. The system says we don't have valid authorization for half our active licenses." "That's strange," I said. "Maybe someone simplified it." He exhaled sharply. "Alara's panicking. Greg wants you to take a look unofficially." "They think it's a software issue." "It isn't," I said. "Then what is it?" "It's the law doing its job." He was silent for a moment. "You built this, didn't you?" "I built safety," I said. "They removed it." By the time I hung up, my inbox was filling with messages. Access error, verification chain missing, need urgent review. I read each one, calm, detached. The system was simply following instructions. When the certification holder was terminated, dependencies expired. That was all. 5 in the evening, Alara appeared at my desk. Her lipstick was perfect, but her voice had cracks. "Salem, we're experiencing some technical irregularities. Greg wants you to consult for a few hours just to stabilize things." I looked at her for a long time. She didn't look like an enemy. She looked like someone who believed in luck more than logic. "I'm no longer authorized," I said. "Greg can fix that." "He can't," I said softly. "He doesn't have the credentials." Her eyes narrowed. "This isn't the time for ego." "It isn't ego," I said. "It's compliance." She opened her mouth, closed it, then forced a smile. "Fine, if you won't help, I'll find someone who will." "You already did," I said. "That's the problem." When she left, I checked the timer again. 29 hours left. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like the slow pulse of a machine counting down. I made tea, sat back, and listened. The storm felt deliberate, as if the world had been waiting for permission to wash something away. The city lights blurred through the glass. Somewhere in another building, Greg and Alara were probably arguing. She would blame Tobai. He would blame the system. And the system, patient and precise, would keep doing exactly what it was designed to do, expire. I turned off the lights, letting the glow of the screen paint the room in blue. 28:41:09 time was an honest thing. It never lied, never apologized, never hurried. It simply moved forward, taking everyone who thought they could outrun it. The next morning arrived heavy and gray. The air felt like the pause between two sentences, waiting for someone brave enough to finish the thought. I woke before the alarm and watched the light crawl across the ceiling. It had the same color as the Helixon lobby, sterile, pale, expensive. I made coffee but didn't drink it. My phone kept buzzing with new emails from the company server, each one stamped with the same subject line, critical alert. By 8, I was on the train. I didn't plan to go in, but old habits move faster than intentions. The carriage smelled of wet coats and stress. A man across from me scrolled through Helixon's stock report on his phone, frowning at the downward trend. When I reached the building, the security guard looked relieved. "Ms. Chandler, thank God. The system's going crazy." "They said you know what to do," I smiled. "They say a lot of things." The elevator ride felt longer than usual. Each floor dinged like a heartbeat. On 20, the doors opened to chaos. People were everywhere, phones pressed to ears, laptops open, voices raised. The compliance dashboard that once pulsed in calm blue now glowed red across every monitor. A banner ran across the top. License verification expired. Greg was pacing near the window, tie loosened, jaw tight. Alara stood beside him, her face pale under the office light. When she saw me, she almost smiled from relief, then stopped herself. "Salem," Greg said, "thank God you're here. We're facing a technical issue. The system thinks our certifications are invalid. It's a glitch, obviously, but..." "It's not a glitch," I said quietly. He stopped walking. "What?" "It's a function," I said. Certification holders' employment ends without legal transfer of authority. Dependent licenses automatically expire. Alara stepped closer. "That can't be real." "It's Section 9B of the Internal Compliance Protocol," I said. "You signed it when you approved my original system 3 years ago." Greg blinked as if trying to replay a memory that no longer existed. "But we didn't terminate you. We just reassigned." "You removed my access," I said. "That counts as termination." The room fell quiet except for the hum of failing servers. Alara folded her arms. "Then fix it. You built it, you can reverse it." "I can't," I said. "Once deactivation starts, it's irreversible without federal oversight. The system is bound to the EMA's database. You'd have to apply for new credentials from scratch." Greg rubbed his temples. "How long will that take?" 6 to 8 months, I said. He stared at me as if I'd just spoken a foreign language. "That's impossible." "We have shipments scheduled, trials in progress." I nodded. "Then you should inform your investors." Alara's voice rose, thin and sharp. "This is sabotage." "No," I said. "This is structure." For a moment no one spoke. Then Greg slammed his fist on the table. "You can't just let the company collapse because of some bureaucratic clause." "I didn't write the clause for collapse," I said. "I wrote it to keep power accountable. You chose to ignore it." He looked at me, truly seeing me for the first time in years, and said almost softly, "You planned this." I met his gaze. "I prepared for it." Outside the conference room, voices rose. Reporters were already calling. The stock alert flashed again on my phone. Helixon shares down 12% in early trading. Alara turned away, her hands trembling as she typed on her phone. "We'll bring in it. We'll find a workaround." "You won't," I said. "Every backup system is tied to the same root certification. You can't replace the foundation by repainting the walls." She glared at me. "You sound proud." "I sound calm," I said. "There's a difference." Greg sank into his chair. "You've doomed us." "No," I said quietly. "You did that the moment you decided rules were obstacles instead of structures." He looked up, something breaking behind his eyes, but before he could speak, the lights flickered. The network had started its scheduled shutdown. People began shouting from the corridor. I left the room before anyone could stop me. My badge still opened the elevator door. No one had revoked it yet. On the ride down, I watched my reflection in the mirror. I didn't look triumphant. I looked tired, the way people look when the truth finally catches up. The lobby was full of employees staring at their phones, refreshing screens that no longer responded. Security guards whispered to each other. One of them handed me a folded printout from the morning newsfeed. "Helixon faces certification crisis, possible federal investigation." I folded it once more and slipped it into my pocket. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air still smelled metallic. I walked to a cafe across the street and ordered tea. Through the window, I could see the tower blinking with red emergency lights. For the first time in years, it looked honest, imperfect, flawed human. My phone buzzed again. "Marcus," I answered. They're trying to call you back in, he said. They want to hire you as an external consultant. I'm not available, he hesitated. Salem, they'll pay anything. It isn't about money. Then what is it about? Integrity, I said, though the word felt too clean for what it carried. When I hung up, the tea had gone cold. I didn't mind. Outside, sirens wailed faintly, distant but approaching. I looked at the timer on my laptop. 2 hours left. The system would finish what it started, no emotion, no hesitation. I closed the screen and whispered to no one, let it end. The city kept moving. Cars, people, light, all of it unaware that one tower across the river was quietly dissolving into history. I stayed until the red lights in the distance stopped blinking. Then I stood, adjusted my coat, and walked away. Morning arrived without color. London looked drained, as if the sky had pulled every shade of confidence from it overnight. I woke to silence, the kind that hums just before bad news breaks. My phone was full of missed calls. Marcus, legal affairs, a number I didn't recognize that was probably Greg's assistant. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I opened my laptop and watched the system logs finalize. At 07:00 a.m. exactly, the last certification tied to my employee ID reached its expiry mark. One line blinked red, then vanished. The database refreshed and displayed a single phrase, authorization chain terminated. It was strangely beautiful, in the same way a storm looks beautiful when seen from far away. Quiet, absolute, and inevitable. On the financial newsfeed, the headline had already appeared. Helixin Therapeutics trading suspended pending regulatory review. The article below it used phrases like catastrophic oversight and federal noncompliance breach. I scrolled slowly, my reflection ghosting across the glass, half there and half gone. The phone rang again. I finally picked up. Salem, Greg's voice was hoarse. You have to help us. Help you what? Reverse this, fix it, call whoever you need to call. I already called them, I said. Years ago, that's why the protocol exists. He cursed under his breath. You're destroying everything we built. No, I said softly. I'm just letting gravity finish the job. For a moment, all I heard was breathing. Then he whispered, do you know what this will do to me? I know exactly, I said and hung up. I dressed carefully, the same gray suit I had worn during our last audit victory, the one he'd said made me look invincible. Outside, the air felt heavy but clean. By the time I reached the office district, cameras were already lined along the sidewalk. Reporters shouted questions at anyone in a Helixin badge. I kept walking. Inside the lobby, the reception screens were black. Employees moved like ghosts, holding boxes, whispering, pretending they still belonged here. Someone recognized me and froze, uncertain whether to thank me or curse me. I nodded once and stepped into the elevator. The 22nd floor was chaos again, but this time without the soundtrack of optimism. Phones rang unanswered. The digital wall that once displayed production metrics now showed a government seal, investigation in progress. Access restricted, Alara was standing by the window. Her white suit had lost its shine, her hair tied back hastily. She turned as I entered. You came, she said, her voice cracked halfway through the word. I wanted to see the claws work, I said. Her eyes were bright with disbelief. You think this is justice? I think it's consequence. She walked toward me, heels clicking sharply on the marble. We were trying to make things better, faster, more humane. You could have helped. I did, I said. By writing the rule that kept you from killing anyone in the process. She flinched. People are losing jobs because of you. They're losing jobs because you trusted shortcuts. For a moment we just stared at each other, two reflections caught in the same pane of glass. Behind her, the city blurred through rain. Greg entered the room then, followed by two federal auditors. His face looked older, the easy charm stripped away. The taller auditor carried a folder stamped with the crest of the European Medicines Authority. Ms. Chandler, the man said, we'll need your statement. I expected that, I said. Greg's voice cracked. Tell them you'll help, please. The auditor interrupted. Mr. Quinn, as of this morning, your operational certifications are void. Until new compliance officers are appointed, you are legally prohibited from production, shipment, or research. Alara whispered, how long will that take? 6 months minimum, he said. Greg turned on me again, eyes wide with disbelief. You're proud of this, aren't you? I looked at the two of them, the perfect couple who thought charm could substitute for competence. Pride isn't the word, I said. Relief is. The auditors led me to a smaller room for the formal interview. The walls were bare except for a clock that ticked a second slower than it should. They asked the usual questions, dates, logins, signatures. I answered each one with precision. When they reached the final question, did you intend for Helixin to fail? I paused. I intended for Hellickson to follow the law, I said. Everything after that was their choice. They nodded, satisfied. One of them, younger and less stern, looked at me as if trying to measure something invisible. This protocol you created, he said. It's elegant, ruthless but elegant. Law is geometry, I said. It only hurts when you bend it. When the interview ended, they thanked me for my cooperation. That word made me smile. Cooperation, something Alara had used like perfume, something Greg had demanded like oxygen. I walked back into the main office. It was almost empty now. Toby sat at a desk, staring at his laptop as the screen flashed access denied. He looked up when I passed. Did you do this? He asked, voice small. No, I said. The system did. His eyes filled with tears, a mix of confusion and guilt. I was just doing what she told me. I know. He waited for more, but there was nothing left to say. I took the elevator down for the last time. The doors closed on the reflection of a building that no longer belonged to anyone. Outside, the reporters were shouting questions again. Ms. Chandler, did you sabotage Hellickson? Was it revenge? I stopped for a moment and faced the cameras. It was compliance, I said, and kept walking. By the end of the week, Hellickson wasn't a company anymore. It was a headline. Every news outlet had a version of the same story. Compliance failure cripples pharmaceutical giant. CEO faces federal inquiry after certification scandal. The words changed, but the meaning didn't. Everyone wanted to know how a single clause could bring down an empire. I sat in my apartment and watched the coverage. The anchor spoke with the excitement of someone tasting blood for the first time. Behind her, the Hellickson Tower flickered on screen, its lights still burning even as the name was being stripped off the building. Sources confirm, she said, that the internal collapse began after a compliance protocol known as Section 9B automatically deactivated the company's federal licenses. The trigger was tied to the termination of a senior officer. She didn't mention my name, but she didn't need to. The camera cut to a file photo of Greg and Alara smiling at a press conference. Then to a silent clip of employees carrying boxes through the rain. I muted the television and opened the window. The night air was cold, the city unusually quiet for a Friday. Down on the street, 2 reporters were talking to the doorman, waving their credentials like weapons. He pointed up toward my floor, then shook his head. They left after a few minutes. My phone buzzed again, unknown number. I let it ring. Then it buzzed a second time. I answered. Salem. It was Marcus. His voice was low. They're done. The board resigned. The federal auditors froze the accounts. Greg's being questioned. Alara hasn't been seen all day. I said nothing. You could come in, he continued. They'd listen to you. The agency's talking about bringing you in as an advisor, maybe even a witness for the reform hearings. Witnesses talk, I said. I prefer documentation, he exhaled. You should still tell your side. People will think you wanted this. They can think what they want. I didn't want anything. I built a safeguard. They triggered it. Salem, he said quietly, you could have stopped it. I could have, I admitted, but they wouldn't have learned anything. There was a pause. You sound like you don't care. I care, I said. I just don't interfere with natural consequences. When the call ended, I stood by the window and watched the reflection of the tower across the river. Without the Hellickson sign, it looked anonymous. A glass skeleton waiting for someone else to name it. I thought of Greg's face when he realized the law wasn't a favor, and Alara's disbelief when she discovered that charm didn't translate into authorization codes. They had treated rules like soft suggestions, something flexible, something that bent for charisma. They never understood that some systems are designed to outlast the people who build them. On the table beside me, the small external drive labeled Vault 9B gleamed faintly under the lamplight. Inside it were all the files, the signatures, the trails of negligence that no one had cared about until now. I placed it into a new envelope and sealed it with a single line written across the front. For legal record, not for release. It wasn't revenge. It was closure. 2 days later, a knock sounded at my door. When I opened it, a woman in a dark coat introduced herself as an investigator from the European Medicines Authority. She carried a leather folder and spoke with calm precision. Ms. Chandler, she said, we've reviewed your system design. Section 9B is now being considered as a potential model for future corporate compliance architecture. The Board of Oversight has requested your consultation. I nodded. You want to replicate it? Adapt it, she said. It's elegant but severe. We'd like to explore less destructive safeguards. Destruction is a matter of perspective, I said. It depends on who ignores the warning signs. She smiled faintly, as if she understood. We'll be in touch. After she left, I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the echo of her footsteps fade. Then I went back inside, sat down, and finally turned the television off. The screen went dark, leaving only my reflection. People would debate for years whether I had planned the collapse. They would call it sabotage, justice, or genius depending on where they stood in the wreckage. The truth was simpler. I had written a rule. The rule had done what rules do. It followed logic. That night I wrote in my notebook for the first time in months. Day 49, system complete, damage contained, consequence delivered. Then below it there is peace and precision. I closed the notebook, placed it beside the sealed envelope, and finally let the silence settle. Outside, the wind carried the smell of rain from across the river. Somewhere in that dark skyline, a company had ended, but something else, something cleaner, had begun to take shape. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just sat there, breathing evenly, until the night itself seemed to agree that everything had happened exactly as it was meant to. The morning the headlines broke, the city felt sharper. Every corner hummed with voices repeating the same name. Helixson, a company once praised for innovation, now dragged across every screen in Europe. I passed a cafe window and saw my reflection beside the words on the television. Corporate negligence under federal review. Whistleblower identity unconfirmed. I didn't correct them. Silence was still the best disguise. At the station, commuters whispered over their phones. One woman said, "They falsified data." Another shook her head. "No, it was some compliance failure. Some woman triggered it." Their eyes met mine for a second. I looked away before recognition had a chance to form. I took the long way home, avoiding the tower altogether. From across the river I could see it, a monolith of glass with its name removed, the blue lights gone, the interior dark except for the top floor where the investigators had set up temporary offices. The building looked hollowed out like a body after the soul has left. By noon my inbox was full again. Reporters, former colleagues, people from universities who had once ignored my research papers now asking for interviews. I deleted them all. Marcus called around 3. His voice was tired, frayed at the edges. "They've charged Greg," he said. "Fraud, data misrepresentation, and obstruction. Alara's negotiating immunity." I leaned back in my chair. "She'll trade everything she knows." "She already has. She gave them the internal communications, the approvals she pushed through without verification. They found her emails to the investment board, false assurances that our trials were fully certified." "She always preferred confidence over clarity," I said. "You sound detached." "I'm consistent," he sighed. "Salem, do you ever regret it?" "Which part?" "Letting it happen." I thought for a long moment. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. "I regret trusting them," I said, "not the outcome." When the call ended, I poured myself a glass of water and stared at the surface until it stilled. The world always seemed clearest just before it broke. That evening, the government held a press conference. I watched from the couch, lights off, laptop balanced on my knees. A spokesperson for the European Medicines Authority explained the situation with measured calm. Helixson Therapeutics failed to maintain valid compliance certification under Section 9B of its own internal framework. This resulted in automatic suspension of all associated licenses. A reporter shouted from the audience, "Who wrote Section 9B?" The spokesperson adjusted his glasses. "An internal officer, Ms. Salem Chandler. Her employment was terminated before the deactivation." The mechanism functioned exactly as designed. The room erupted in questions, voices overlapping, flashes bursting like small explosions. I closed the laptop before they could show my face. Outside my apartment, the city lights blurred into streaks of color reflected on the wet pavement. For the first time in weeks, I stepped out into the night. The air smelled of rain and relief. I walked without destination, following the river until the noise of traffic faded. The world looked almost peaceful from here. Behind me on the big screen outside the news building, the broadcast still played in silence. My name scrolled across the ticker, white letters against blue. I sat on a bench and watched the water. Somewhere inside that current was the reflection of everything I'd built and everything I'd allowed to fall. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. This time, I answered. A woman's voice. "Ms. Chandler, this is Lee from Novogene Biocore. We'd like to discuss a consulting opportunity." I said nothing. "We've been following the Helixson situation," she continued. "Your work was impressive. Our board believes you could help us strengthen our compliance infrastructure, perhaps even design something similar to Section 9B, but less punitive." The irony almost made me laugh. "You want the rule that destroyed your competitor. We want the precision that kept you untouched." I let the silence stretch before replying. "Send the details." When the call ended, I stayed there, letting the rain return in thin, patient drops. The city glowed faintly under them, as if washing off the residue of greed and panic. I thought of Alara then, where she might be hiding, what mask she'd wear next. For a moment, I almost pitied her. Not for losing, but for never understanding the rules of the game she'd played. The river whispered quietly, endless, and indifferent. It carried reflections, but kept none of them. I whispered to the dark, "The law doesn't forgive, it remembers." The wind carried the words away, scattering them among the lights of the city that had already begun to forget the name Helixon. 3 days after the press conference, I became a symbol I never asked to be. The newspapers called me the woman who ended a giant. Blogs called me a modern Cassandra. I didn't read them for validation. I read them for accuracy, and they all failed in their own way. They wanted a villain or a hero. I was neither. I was a technician of consequence. Nova Jean's official offer arrived that Friday. The email was polite, efficient, wrapped in admiration disguised as professionalism. They wanted me to head a new department, Global Ethical Compliance and Risk. The title felt absurdly large, like a crown meant to hide a bruise. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I met Marcus for coffee at a small cafe near the legal district. He looked exhausted but alive. "They're tearing Helixon apart," he said. "Auditors, regulators, investors, every thread they pull reveals another lie." "Lies are like that," I said. "They multiply quietly." He sipped his espresso. "You could help shape the reforms, you know. People are listening now. The agency might even build the new compliance standards around your design." "Then they'll just repeat the cycle," I said. "Someone will find a way to exploit it. The problem isn't structure, it's arrogance." "You sound like you hate them." "I don't. I just stopped protecting them." He studied me for a moment. "You really think this was the only way?" "It was the last way," I said. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the soft hiss of the espresso machine. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The world always found its rhythm again. Later that evening, I walked along the Thames, the air cold against my face. Across the river, the Helixon Tower stood dark and empty, its reflection rippling over the water. The building was already being referred to as a case study in universities. Students would analyze it one day, draw timelines, write essays about failure and accountability. They would never feel the texture of it, the silence of people losing their certainty, the hum of servers shutting down like breath leaving a body. When I reached home, there was a new message waiting from Nova Jean's director. A simple question: "What would it take for you to build us something unbreakable?" I stared at it for a long time. Unbreakable? That word didn't exist in my vocabulary anymore. Everything breaks. That's what keeps the world honest. I closed the laptop and stood by the window. The city was breathing again. Delivery trucks hummed, streetlights flickered, and somewhere below, a couple laughed loudly under an umbrella. Life had moved on. My phone rang again, a different number this time. The voice on the other end was calm, clipped, official. "Ms. Chandler, this is the Office of Corporate Ethics, European Division. We'd like to invite you to testify at the public hearing next month. It's not an inquiry, more a discussion on reform. They want your perspective on what went wrong." "Everything," I said. "Everything?" "Everything went exactly the way it should," I said. "That's what went wrong." The woman on the phone hesitated, unsure whether I was being cynical or precise. "We'll send you the details," she said finally. When I hung up, the quiet felt heavier than before. I sat down and opened the sealed envelope that had been waiting on my desk. Inside were printed copies of the original system schematics, the very first drafts of Section 9B. The ink was faded in places, smudged where I had touched it too many times. I read through the old notes, line by line, and realized that I had written not just a safeguard but a philosophy. It wasn't about punishment. It was about symmetry. Actions should return to their owners, like light reflecting off glass. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed briefly, then faded. The city exhaled. The next morning, Nova Jean's HR director called again. "We'd like to arrange a meeting," she said. "Our CEO was impressed by your interview with the agency." "I didn't give an interview." "You didn't have to," she said with a smile in her voice. "Your silence spoke louder." That afternoon, I accepted the offer. They sent a car the next day. As we crossed the bridge, I looked out at the skyline. The Helixon Tower was already wrapped in scaffolding. Workers were removing the last letters from the top. The H was gone. The E dangled halfway. By the time we reached the other side, it was just Lixon, a fragment of a word that used to mean something. At Nova Jean's office, everything smelled new, fresh paint, new leather, ambition disguised as optimism. The CEO, a quiet man with careful eyes, greeted me personally. "We want to learn from Helixon," he said. "We want to build something sustainable." "Sustainability isn't about building stronger walls," I said. "It's about teaching people why walls exist." He nodded. That's why we need you. I looked at the skyline through the glass wall of his office. The river shimmered under the winter light. Then let's start with one rule, I said. Nothing is unbreakable. He smiled, uncertain whether it was a warning or a promise. When I left the building, evening had already fallen. The city glowed beneath a thin mist, soft and distant. I walked toward the bridge, feeling the hum of traffic beneath my feet. Behind me, another tower was already rising, new, gleaming, certain of its invincibility. I whispered to the air, every empire begins with good intentions. Then I kept walking, the river beside me, endless and patient, carrying away the pieces of everything that thought it could last forever. The hearing took place in a building older than most of the companies it judged. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, the kind of architecture meant to remind people that power once belonged to stone, not money. Cameras lined the corridor outside, waiting to catch faces as they entered. When I arrived, the reporters turned toward me like weather vanes catching a sudden gust. Flash after flash filled the hallway. Questions rose above the noise. Did you plan this? Was it revenge? Did you mean to destroy them? I kept walking. Silence travels farther than answers. Inside, the chamber was cold. A semicircle of officials sat behind polished desks, their laptops open, eyes bright with curiosity. This wasn't a trial, it was theater disguised as procedure. They didn't want punishment, they wanted clarity. The chairwoman, an older woman with steel gray hair and steady eyes, began with formality. Ms. Chandler, thank you for attending. You understand that this is not an accusation but an inquiry into systemic failure. I understand, I said. She nodded. In your words, what went wrong? Everything in the room slowed. I could feel the weight of the microphones, the steady blinking of the recorders. My voice sounded calm when it came. What went wrong, I said, was belief. They believed the rules existed for someone else. The panel murmured among themselves. The chairwoman leaned forward. You designed Section 9B, the protocol that ultimately triggered the shutdown. Was that intentional protection or premeditated risk? It was inevitability, I said. A mechanism designed to respond to neglect. So you anticipated this outcome? I anticipated arrogance. The outcome was just math. A few members of the panel exchanged glances. One of them, younger, leaned into the microphone. You make it sound impersonal. It was, that's what law is. It doesn't hate or forgive, it calculates. The chairwoman smiled faintly, not kindly, just knowingly. And yet you wrote it. I did, I said, because human judgment is too easily persuaded. She tapped her pen thoughtfully. Ms. Chandler, do you consider yourself responsible for Helixson's collapse? The question hung in the air. I thought of the building with its missing letters, the people packing boxes, the faces behind screens that once showed progress. I consider myself responsible for the structure, I said, not for how it was used. A murmur rippled through the audience. The chairwoman nodded once. Understood. What, in your opinion, should be learned from this? That innovation without discipline is just chaos wearing perfume. A few people chuckled quietly, unsure if they were allowed to. The chairwoman didn't. And what about accountability? It should never depend on memory, I said. It should be built into the design. For a moment, the room was silent. Then she said, Thank you, Ms. Chandler. Please remain while we hear the remaining statements. I sat back as Greg took the stand. He looked smaller somehow, deflated. The same voice that once filled boardrooms now trembled as he read from his prepared notes. We made mistakes, he said. We trusted the wrong processes. We didn't foresee the extent of the system's rigidity. He paused and looked at me. We didn't foresee how much damage one person could cause. I didn't look away. The panel questioned him gently, as if speaking to someone already punished enough by humiliation. He talked about leadership, about trusting innovation, about being misled. He never said her name. Alara's seat beside him remained empty. When the chairwoman asked about accountability, he said, We relied on people who valued control over collaboration. I almost smiled. Even now, he framed caution as failure. The hearing adjourned in the late afternoon. Outside, the press waited again. They wanted statements, emotion, anything that would fit into a headline. I gave them nothing. In the taxi, the driver glanced at me through the mirror. You're that woman, right? The one with the rule. I nodded. He hesitated. Was it worth it? Yes, I said, because it was true. He didn't ask more. Back home, the sky was the color of old paper. I sat by the window and wrote the last line in the notebook I had started weeks before. Reckoning complete. Balance restored. I closed it and left it on the table. For the first time in months, I felt no need to check the time. The countdown had ended. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was earned. The following week, the report was released. 52 pages of language so careful it sounded afraid of itself. It spoke of systemic oversight, structural mismanagement, and an internal safeguard functioning as intended. They never used the word failure. Bureaucracies rarely do. Failure suggests someone made a choice. Oversight sounds like gravity. My name appeared only once, in a single sentence on page 34. Protocol 9B, designed by Ms. Salem Chandler, operated as a self-correcting compliance mechanism, neutralizing unauthorized activity. There were no adjectives, no speculation, no moral weight, just a fact wrapped in punctuation. The world moved on faster than I expected. Markets stabilized, new companies filled the vacuum, investors returned to smiling. Helixson's assets were auctioned, its patents bought by smaller firms who promised transparency and new beginnings. I knew how temporary that promise was. The corporate world has no memory, only appetite. The day after the report went public, I received an invitation from the Office of Corporate Ethics. They wanted me to consult on a European framework, a new model for compliance architecture inspired by my work. The Chandler Standard, they called it. I read the letter 3 times. It sounded like both recognition and irony. The system they once ignored would now become mandatory for everyone. I met Marcus again that evening. We sat by the river, the same place we'd once watched Helixson's lights. They were gone now, replaced by the blank facade of a future tenant. He handed me a folded copy of the Financial Review. My name was on the cover, The Woman Who Made Law Inevitable. I laughed softly. They make it sound like prophecy. Maybe it is, he said. You built something that forces truth into the open. Truth doesn't need force, I said. It just needs time. He looked at me for a long moment. You know they'll study this for decades. You could write about it, shape the story yourself. I already shaped it, I said. Writing it down would only weaken it. When we parted, the air smelled faintly of rain. The city lights shimmered on the surface of the Thames like thin wires of gold. I stood there long after he'd gone, thinking about how easily empires dissolve, first into panic, then into paperwork, and finally into memory. The next morning, I accepted the offer. The ethics office sent a car to take me to Brussels, where the new committee would meet. The driver was quiet, efficient. Halfway through the journey, he said without looking back, "You don't talk like other people from your world." What world is that? The one that believes in control? I smiled. Control is an illusion. I only believe in design. The meeting took place in a high, glass-walled chamber overlooking the city. Officials from half a dozen countries were there. They spoke in turns about reform, digital accountability, and global transparency. Words that sounded clean until they were used too often. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and said, "Systems should not exist to prevent human error. They should exist to reflect it. That's the only way to make consequences visible." They nodded, writing notes they'd later turn into policy. Someone asked if I'd consider leading a task force. I said I would advise, not lead. Leadership was for those who needed applause. I was finished with applause. Later, in my temporary apartment overlooking the square, I opened my laptop. A message from Novagene waited. "We've implemented your framework. It works beautifully. We feel safe again." I typed a single line in reply. Safety is the first symptom of complacency. Then I deleted it and closed the screen. Outside, bells rang from a distant church. The sound drifted across the rooftops like something searching for meaning. I realized, not for the first time, that peace doesn't come from closure. It comes from precision, from knowing exactly where things belong. That night, I wrote one last note in my journal. The reckoning was never about punishment. It was about alignment. The world corrected itself, as all systems must, eventually. I looked at those words until the ink dried, then tore out the page and folded it into a small square. I placed it between the pages of the old Helixson report, an irony that felt almost merciful. Before turning off the lights, I stood by the window and looked down at the city. Somewhere beneath that maze of glass and ambition, another company was already rising, convinced it had learned the lesson. Maybe it had, maybe it hadn't. I didn't wish them luck. I only wished them time. Time is the purest auditor. It never forgets. I whispered to the night, balance restored, and let the silence close like a seal. The first time I went back to London after the hearings, the city looked newly washed. The light along the river had that winter clarity that makes glass honest. From the taxi, I could see the tower that used to hold Helixson. It had a new name now, a neutral one that sounded like a consulting firm and a yoga studio at the same time. The facade was the same, but the lobby had been remade into a sculpture of transparency. Water slid down a wide sheet of stone. Plants clustered in curated patience. Everything wanted to say we have learned. I was in town for a keynote. International ethics in business. The invitation had been polite, then insistent, then reverent. I said yes because sometimes saying yes keeps the story from being rewritten by people who prefer a prettier ending. The conference hall smelled of wool coats and ambition. On the stage, the screens showed my name with the same cool font they use for weather and stock prices. People greeted me with the careful warmth reserved for a person who once held a match near a house and then walked away without burning. They wanted insight without smoke. They wanted certainty without weight. Backstage, a young woman waited with a tablet clutched to her chest. She wore a dark suit that still felt like a costume on her body. Her badge said Iris. She lifted her eyes and tried not to stare. "You saved my master thesis," she said. "You made it relevant." "I did not save anything," I said. "I wrote a mechanism." She nodded, brave enough to ask the question that had been waiting in the hallway outside every room I entered. "Did you mean for all of it to happen that way?" I told her the only answer that has ever been true. I meant for the rule to be stronger than opinion. The stage manager motioned. I walked into the light, and the light held me the way rules hold a warning. The room quieted with that pleasant hush that pretends to be respect but is really curiosity in formal dress. I spoke about design that reflects behavior instead of trying to control it. I spoke about time as the only fair auditor. I did not say revenge. I did not say triumph. I left those words to the people who still needed them. After the applause, the questions came. A man in a dark blue tie asked how to balance innovation and control. I told him there is no balance. There is only cause and effect. A woman from a Nordic bank asked whether Section 9B had been cruel. I said cruelty needs intent. Geometry only needs a straight line. When it ended, Iris walked with me to the side door that opened onto the terrace. The river moved below with its usual authority. She said her company had adopted my framework. She said people grumbled at first, but then they slept better. She asked if that was how it felt when I built the first version. "It felt like the air after a storm," I said. "You hear what was always there." We stood in silence long enough to become part of the view. Downstream, a tourist boat sent soft waves against the stone. Across the water, the old tower held its new letters without shame. The present never apologizes for arriving. Iris said she wanted to work in compliance because she believed in fairness. I told her fairness was a feeling, and that feelings are beautiful but unsafe. "Believe in sequence," I said. "Believe in records that cannot be charmed. Believe in designs that ignore mood." She smiled in the careful way of a person choosing the shape of her future. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a paperback with a plain white cover. On it, in small type, was the title I had written late one night when the city was sleeping, and I needed a sentence that did not. "Guideline for Successor Compliance Officers. Version 1. She asked for a signature. I wrote her name and the line that steadies me when rooms become loud. "Do not protect power from consequence." On my way back to the hotel, I asked the driver to pass the old address. He circled the block slowly. Inside the lobby, a new sculpture caught the light like a net. A woman stood near the reception desk arranging small glass bottles on a tray. For a moment my breath stopped. It was Alara, or it was someone who had learned her posture. The face was familiar in a way billboards are familiar. A clean smile, eyes that bounced light, a way of standing that invented a camera where there was none. The plaque beside the pop-up stand said Wellness Afternoon with Guest Mentor. I watched the woman laugh, lift her hands, explain how breath makes order possible. I wondered if breath knows what it forgives. Back at the hotel, a message was waiting at the desk. No name, no letterhead, just a sheet folded twice. Inside was a single sentence written in a careful hand. Some lessons cost 400 million. There was no signature, but the handwriting belonged to a man who used to sign bonuses the way other people signed birthday cards. I folded the paper and placed it inside the back flap of my notebook without deciding how I felt. That night, I walked the bridge alone. The city offered its soft machinery. Distant sirens, the whisper of buses, a conversation that could have been laughter or grief. I stopped in the middle and let the cold come up through the stone. My reflection and the reflection of the towers made a braid on the water. It looked like a graph without labels. It looked like cause and effect. A group of students passed behind me, talking about a case study. I heard my name and the word inevitable. I turned slightly and caught a few phrases. If she had not built it, someone else would. The room had no oxygen. They had to open a window. They laughed softly, the way people laugh when they are not afraid of the past. In my room, I opened the notebook and began a new page. Part 7. Return, not to a company and not to a city. A return to the first reason I took the job before the titles, before the meetings, before the slow grind of prestige. I wrote a sentence I had not written before. The work is not to keep bad people from acting. The work is to keep consequences attached to the action. Then I closed the book and pressed my palm against the cover until the heat of my hand faded and the paper cooled. Sleep came easily for the first time in months. No noise behind the eyelids, no falling towers, no alarms waking the room. Only the shape of a river and the feeling of a key that no longer needs a lock. In the morning, I would meet Iris for coffee and talk about the parts of the framework that still made people angry. In the afternoon, I would sit with a small team from the ethics office and sketch a lighter way to build the same strength. In the evening, I would walk past the tower again, not to forgive it and not to condemn it, but to witness the plain fact that buildings are only stories written in stone. Stories change their names. The stone stays. When I turned off the lamp, the room held one last line of light along the curtain. It looked like a measure on a sheet of music waiting for the first note. I knew the note by heart now. It was not loud and it was not soft. It was precise. In the morning, the sky was the clear gray that makes decisions easier. I met Iris at a small cafe wedged between a tailor and a florist. She had a notebook already open, pages divided into tidy boxes. She said her team kept pushing back on the alert thresholds. They wanted fewer red flags. They said constant warnings made people numb. Warnings do not numb, I said. Distance does. Keep the alerts but bring them closer. Make the flags conversational. Ask a question before you deny a step. She wrote quickly, questions before denial. Then she looked up. Do you ever get tired of being the person who says no? I almost smiled. I do not say no. I say now show me the proof. When we finished our coffee, she walked me partway to the ethics office. At the corner, she stopped. Will you ever write a book? She asked. People want to know how to think like you. I told her thinking like me was not the point. The point was designing so that no one has to think like me for the system to tell the truth. She nodded as if filing the sentence in the drawer where she kept phrases that would become her bones. The meeting room at the office was bright and undecorated. A whiteboard covered one wall. I stood in front of it with a dry marker and wrote 3 words in large letters. Sequence, evidence, sympathy. The last one made a few brows lift. I explained that sympathy belongs in the room but not in the code. The code must be blind so that people do not have to pretend they are. We diagrammed flows until the sun shifted and made the table look like a map of pale rivers. Midway through, an assistant brought a sealed envelope to the director. He glanced at it, then slid it across to me. For your attention. No sender listed. Inside was a short printed statement from Greg's counsel. He would not contest the findings. He had accepted a temporary ban from executive positions. At the bottom was a single handwritten line added in ink darker than the rest. I should have kept you. It did not feel like apology. It felt like arithmetic finally showing its remainder. I placed the page back in the envelope and returned to the board. If we want systems that do not fail loudly, I said, they must be allowed to fail quietly at the smallest possible step. No more cliff edges. Only shallow stairs where mistakes descend without breaking bones. Someone wrote shallow stairs in the margin and underlined it twice. At noon, we took a short break. I stood at the window and watched a boy in the square trying to balance on a low stone wall. He lifted his arms like a wire walker and grinned when he reached the end. The wall had kept him honest without making him afraid. That was the shape I wanted for the world. In the afternoon, I returned to the tower with the new name. There was a public exhibit in the atrium about responsible design. Screens displayed animated diagrams of trust. A guide spoke softly to a group about lessons learned from past failures. No names, only shapes. I walked the perimeter and let the light touch my hands. Near the back, beside a living wall of plants, I saw her. Elara wore a gray dress that made her brightness gentler. She was not on a stage. She was standing with a woman in a maintenance uniform, holding a stack of folded towels and listening as if the towels carried a story. When the conversation ended, she turned and saw me. Her face did a small thing that was neither smile nor flinch. She walked over slowly, as if the floor might judge the pace. You look well, she said, so do you. For a moment we looked at the water running down the stone sheet. It made a sound like distant rain. She said she taught wellness courses now, small groups, breathing, schedules that give people back an hour a day. She said the students liked the quiet. I asked if she liked it too. She said she was learning. We stood there with our reflections wavering on the wet stone. She glanced at my hands. Do you carry it? She asked. The weight of what happened. I carry the design, I said. The weight belongs to time. She studied my face as if there were a switch she hoped to find. Then she nodded. I wanted the world to be softer, she said. I chose the wrong way to get there. Softness without structure becomes harm, I said. But softness with structure can heal. You might be closer now than you were. She breathed out slowly and some small tension left her shoulders. You did not humiliate me, she said. You could have. I shook my head. Humiliation teaches noise. Structure teaches silence. She smiled at that. Not the old camera smile. A smaller one that looked like a door left ajar in summer. We parted without shaking hands. There are people you do not touch because the air already holds too much story between you. On my last evening in the city, I returned to the bridge. The water moved with its steady authority, carrying the day down toward the sea. My phone vibrated and I almost ignored it, then looked. A message from Iris. We implemented questions before denial. The room felt brighter. Thank you. I typed back only 2 words. Keep measuring. A wind rose off the water and lifted the ends of my coat. I thought about the rooms I had left and the rooms ahead. Brussels and some winter seminar in Vienna and a closed-door workshop at Novagene where they wanted to talk about culture instead of code. I would tell them what I always tell them. Culture is just code written in behavior. You refactor it the same way. Slowly, repeatedly. With tests you actually run. When I returned to the hotel, I opened my suitcase and found the old envelope I had tucked behind the lining months ago. The birthday card from my mother that had never been sent. I had brought it without noticing, a habit the hand remembered after the mind stopped counting. I read the single line she had written in her neat schoolteacher script. Be the person who locks the door and keeps the key safe. It sounded like prophecy and plain advice at once. I sat at the desk and wrote a letter back to a woman who could no longer read it. I told her the door had been locked and unlocked and replaced with a weight sensor and a light that stayed on even when no one was in the room. I told her the key was not metal anymore. It was a set of conditions that refused to lie. I folded the page and placed it beside the card. The 2 papers looked like old friends finally sitting down after years of missing each other. Sleep came easy again. No alarms, no red banners, only the small tick of the travel clock and the softer tick underneath it that belongs to blood. The flight out left early. Clouds folded under the wings like a clean sheet. Somewhere above the channel, I opened the notebook and wrote the final entry. Section 9B was never a weapon. It was a mirror. People choose what to bring to it, then they blame the glass. I closed the book and pressed my palm to the cover the way you steady a heartbeat. The cabin lights dimmed and the plane leaned into its path. I thought of Iris at her desk, of Marcus reading another report with coffee gone cold, of Alara listening to someone who thought towels were just towels until she asked a second question. I thought of Greg's lines scrawled like an afterthought and how some men only understand weight when it is removed. Clouds parted, and the sea showed its precise skin. I remembered the boy on the wall and the shallow stairs and the feeling of the rule sitting quietly inside the world, not shouting, not punishing, only connecting act to echo. When the wheels touched down, the soft jolt felt like punctuation. Not a full stop. A line break that promised another paragraph. I stepped into the bright morning of a city that was not London, and the air smelled like paper and citrus and the first page of a new manual. I walked without hurry, carrying nothing heavy, and let the day begin with the simplest sentence I knew. Work with the grain of truth. The rest arranges itself.